They told you hell was real, that fire waits for the curious, that if you ever walked away, you'd burn forever. But here's the truth they hope you never say out loud. You were never afraid of hell. You were afraid of thinking for yourself. Because when you've been raised in fear, freedom feels like rebellion, and rebellion feels like danger. So they taught you to doubt your own clarity, to call your instincts deception, to confuse love with loyalty and fear with faith. But what if I told you hell isn't real? And deep down, you already know that. This isn't about proof, it's about control. This isn't about saving your soul, it's about silencing your questions. So today, we're pulling back the curtain, not to mock belief, but to understand the machinery behind it, why hell was created, why it still holds power, and how to break free from the fear that never had the evidence to back it up. Because the absence of proof isn't just suspicious, it's the whole point. Let's talk about it. If God isn't in hell, maybe that's the point. Let's start with a thought that should disturb you just a little. If hell is where God isn't, maybe that's the safest place to be. Because biblically, when God shows up, things fall apart. In heaven, the literal dwelling place of God, there's war. Not metaphorical, not spiritualized, an actual insurrection led by a created being who supposedly had full access to God's presence and still said, nah, I think I can run this better. Think about what that says, not just about Satan, but about the environment that God created. Whatever heaven was supposed to be, it wasn't stable enough to keep peace among angels. But then consider Eden. This so-called paradise, two humans get kicked out for doing the one thing that made them more aware, more curious, more human. And for that, they're punished with pain, exile, and a curse on every generation after them. Not because they killed someone, not because they destroyed the planet, but because they sought wisdom. Then there's Earth, our shared home. And according to the biblical narrative, it was such a disappointment to God that he drowned nearly every living thing, man, woman, child, animal, in a global genocide, then had the audacity to promise that he wouldn't do it again. This sounds like an abusive spouse, not a perfect creator. And mind you, not because it was wrong, but because it was messy. And if you think the new heaven and the new earth will finally be the peaceful version, Revelation ends with yet another war, another cosmic battle, another round of judgment and fire. You start to notice a pattern, a sociological pattern, actually, because what we're dealing with isn't divine justice, it's authoritarian dysfunction. Every environment where God asserts control eventually devolves into conflict, punishment, or collapse. And if we take the story on its own terms, hell is the only place God isn't micromanaging. Theologically speaking, it's framed as abandonment. But from a psychological standpoint, it sounds more like freedom, or at the very least, relief from a tyrannical presence. See, authoritarian systems always need an enemy, a reason why their brutality is justified. And what better enemy than the person or the place where God is no longer present? Hell doesn't sound scary because of fire. It sounds scary because of framing, because we've been conditioned to fear independence, to fear what happens when we're no longer controlled. But what if that fear isn't proof of danger? What if that fear is a symptom of spiritual trauma? Hell isn't even a biblical doctrine. Let's tell the truth that many pastors hope that you'll never Google. Hell, as is preached today, eternal conscious torment, fire that never goes out, devils poking you for eternity, that version of hell doesn't exist in the Bible. Not consistently, not clearly, and definitely not originally. It's a stitched together mythology, a theological Frankenstein built from mistranslations, cultural borrowings, and centuries of fear-based storytelling. In the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, there's no talk of hell the way modern Christians describe it. The dead go to Sheol, which isn't a place of punishment. It's like a neutral holding space, more like a silent graveyard than a torture chamber. No fire, no torment, just death. By the time we reach the New Testament, the writers had access to Roman power, Greek philosophy, and generations of religious trauma, and they started blending it all together. Now you see terms like Gehenna, which is a literal garbage dump outside Jerusalem where refuse and corpses were burned. getting rebranded as a metaphor for eternal punishment, not because that's what it meant, but because it felt useful. Add in Hades, borrowed from Greek mythology, and suddenly you've got a stew of pagan concepts dressed up in Jewish clothing. Even the infamous lake of fire from Revelation is a one-off apocalyptic vision, a symbolic fever dream in a genre built on metaphor, not doctrine. But somehow modern Christianity took all of that, boiled it down, and started teaching children that if they disobey God, they'll burn forever. Let me say that again, folks. Children. This wasn't just a doctrinal shift, this was a psychological assault. It taught entire generations to fear curiosity, fear questions, and even fear their own humanity. Because if you doubt even a little, the consequence isn't correction, it's combustion. That's not spirituality. That's emotional terrorism. And sociologically, it makes perfect sense because once religion becomes a tool of control, it needs a mechanism of enforcement. And nothing enforces obedience like the threat of invisible consequences. You can't escape it, you can't see it, and worst of all, you can't prove it doesn't exist. It becomes the perfect prison, one that doesn't need walls, only belief. So no, hell is not a biblical doctrine. It's a manufactured threat, a colonized interpretation, a fear-shaped leash. And maybe the reason they defend it so hard is because without it, the whole system unravels. Here's the thing, heaven ain't it either. Let's be real. A lot of folks are only clinging to the idea of hell because they're still seduced by the idea of heaven. But here's the problem nobody wants to admit. Even heaven doesn't sound like a place worth going. Not when you actually read what the Bible says about it. Because that warm, sentimental version where you reunite with your grandma, catch up with your childhood dog, and sit around a cloud-based family reunion, that's not in the Bible. That's fan fiction. The actual text paints a very different picture. Heaven biblically is not about fulfillment. It's not about rest. It's not about reunion. It's about service, slavery, endless, mindless, unquestioning service. You bow, you sing, you cast your crowns, you cry, holy, 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 on repeat, forever, in a loop. That's not paradise, that's programming. That's divine labor with no days off, and psychologically, this isn't just a bad vacation idea, it's the blueprint of Stockholm Syndrome spirituality. You've been told for so long that you're unworthy, that you're broken, that you deserve wrath, that the only thing standing between you and eternal fire is the whim of a God who chose not to kill you. So by the time you get to salvation, you're so relieved you weren't destroyed that you'll accept anything as peace, even eternal servitude, even a heaven where your individuality is erased, your curiosity is a threat, and your relationships don't even seem to matter anymore. And that's the kicker. The people preaching this idea of heaven as a reunion, they're usually the same ones preaching that your loved ones won't even be there unless they said the right prayer or joined the right church. So what is heaven then? A place where you're forced to forget who you love so you don't miss them while you sing? Or worse, a place where you're perfectly okay with them burning because now you're one with God's will. Either way, it's not a dream, it's a nightmare with a halo. Sociologically, this isn't new. Empires have always sold their people on afterlife rewards to justify current life suffering. Be a good slave now, and you'll be free in the afterlife. But the problem with this particular one is that the answer is be a good slave now, and you'll get to be a good slave in the afterlife. Give everything now, and you'll inherit eternity as a slave forever. But what if that promise was never even real? What if it was just the carrot they dangled in front of us while they built palaces on our backs? Because let's be honest, a heaven that requires eternal slavery isn't heaven. It's the perfect kingdom for the person on the throne. There's no evidence, just exploitation. Let's say the quiet part out loud. There's never been a single piece of credible, verifiable evidence that hell or heaven actually exists. Not one. Not a photograph, not a GPS coordinate, not a death certificate stamped returned from the afterlife, nothing. And that should be the end of the conversation. But instead, it's where the exploitation begins. Because when people can't prove something but need you to believe it, what do? They sell it. They dress it up in emotion, wrap it in tradition, and weaponize it through fear. And the result is an entire spiritual industrial complex built on a lie so effective people will literally surrender their lives to it. You've got preachers making millions off hellfire sermons, books about kids who died and saw heaven getting movie deals. You've got televangelists screaming about eternal damnation right before asking you to sow a $77 seed offering to secure your blessing. It's not theology, it's theater. And the longer the show goes on, the more tickets they sell. And we haven't even talked about the fakes, forged relics passed off as ancient proof, photoshopped angel sightings that miraculously stopped around the same time the internet learned what image editing was, fabricated stories of hell being discovered in the middle of earth, pumped through tabloids and pulpits to keep people scared and submissive. But here's what's even more disturbing. Every time someone takes time to fake evidence for hell, heaven, or Jesus, they're admitting something they'll never say out loud, that they knew that there was no evidence and believed that you wouldn't check. That's not faith. That's predatory psychology. It preys on trust, it exploits vulnerability, and it works best on the desperate, the grieving, the anxious, the isolated, and the ill-informed. People who are looking for peace and get sold to prison instead. Sociologically, this is how power maintains itself, not through force, but through imagination. If they can make you afraid of what happens when you stop obeying, they don't need chains. Your thoughts become the sale. And it's not just theological. People lose everything over this. Relationships shattered because someone deconstructed. Children disowned for leaving the faith. Families ripped apart over who's saved and who's not. Grown adults living in anxiety, depression, and trauma from a place they've never seen and will never be able to escape because it was instilled in them before they could even read. That's not religion. That's a racket. That's a fear-based Ponzi scheme where the payout is never coming, but the cost is paid in real life. And the most tragic part, most people don't even realize they were sold something that never existed. Fear sells better than facts. By now, you might be wondering if the doctrine is weak, if the evidence is missing, if the reward sounds hollow and the punishment sounds staged. The answer is because fear is the cheapest way to control a human being. It doesn't require truth, it just requires a trigger. And once religion figured out that fear sells better than facts, it stopped evolving. It stopped asking questions. It stopped growing. It just started repeating the same threat louder and earlier. They don't wait until you're an adult to introduce you to hell. They whisper it into the ears of children before they understand metaphor, before they can distinguish myth from memory. And once it's in there, it becomes a reflex, not a belief system, a trauma response. And that's the part that gets overlooked because people think they believe in hell because it's true, but most don't. Most people believe in hell because they were trained to fear not believing. That's not conviction. That's conditioning. Sociologically, it's the same tactic used in cults, in abusive relationships, and in authoritarian regimes. Break the person down, isolate them, tell them they're broken, then offer them a way out, but only if they never question you again. And spiritually, that turns a promise of salvation into a lifetime subscription to obedience. You can't leave, you can't think, you can't question. Because what if you're wrong? The what if becomes the thing that haunts people. The what if becomes the thing that keeps them in place. It keeps them quiet. It keeps them paying, and it keeps the whole system alive. But what if you're not wrong? What if this entire thing has been a manipulation? What if the fear you feel isn't a warning from God, but a scar from religious trauma? And what if waking up from that fear isn't a fall from grace, but the first real step toward freedom? Because the truth is, once you stop being afraid of hell, you start living like you've already escaped it. And that's what they're really afraid of. Not that hell isn't real, but that you will realize that it never was. If this spoke to you, hit like. If you've ever felt the weight of this fear or clawed your way out of it, drop your story in the comments. I'd love to read about it. And if you're ready to keep building a life without superstition, shame, or fear, then subscribe and make sure to join our email list. Not for heaven, not to avoid hell, but because you're done being controlled by stories that collapse under questions. We don't need fear to live well. We don't need hell to find meaning. We don't need religion to be free. We're doing it right now, together. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, keep rising.